Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm almost Claudia. Wuthering Heights has been covered a couple of times on this channel already, and I have a sinking feeling that fairly shortly after this video, it's going to be covered again. What even is that wedding dress? Much less 18th century, more 1980s. I mean, I don't mind if Emerald Fennell wants to do a modern adaptation of this book, but she's not, and besides, I can't really imagine how it would work. Although set in the late Georgian period, Wuthering Heights has a lot of the tropes you'd expect from Victorian literature. It's got rich people in massive houses, visiting each other, falling in love, and dying of illnesses unheard of in the last couple of centuries, but which RFK Jr. is determined to bring back. What if America really is just setting itself up for a modern adaptation of Wuthering Heights? There are ways you can adapt these stories into modern times, of course, but Wuthering Heights' specific reliance on the particulars of death and taxes in the Georgian period, and land ownership more generally, make it tricky to modernise without losing much of the sort of inherent grief and despair that makes the story what it is. So then, it's a book very much of its times, not only when it was set, but also when it was written. Gothic literature with an imperfect third-person narrative was very much in vogue. The language is archaic and impenetrable to those who are not really used to it. It's a language that a lot of people get a lot of genuine pleasure from reading, but also that a lot of people get a lot of pleasure from pretending to have read. And a greater number than either, of course, have read it against their wishes. Usually for school, but occasionally as a bit for YouTube. As a piece of Victorian literature though, Wuthering Heights is genuinely beloved. We'll get into why, and I'll be spoiling a lot of the story along the way, so if you haven't read it, I don't know why you clicked on this video, but you're very welcome. Here we have a dark Gothic romance whose central themes aren't so much about whom the central characters will marry, although it's got that too, but more about jealousy and revenge and possessiveness, and how these sorts of emotions and their expression can leave one trapped in a point in their past, unable to move on. There's a YouTube channel called The Retro Sofa that provides a kind of positive, wholesome example of this. But this book does not. Heathcliff is not kind. He's a hate-filled and abusive brute, and of course he's not going to hold himself responsible for his actions. He sees himself, I suppose like many men, as a simple creature where input A leads to result A. Now, for example, we logical and enlightened people know that Edgar Linton and Catherine are free to marry one another should they so choose, and it's nobody else's business. But despite Edgar's thorough decency throughout, he becomes Heathcliff's nemesis because Heathcliff feels he's taken something, not really someone, that he sees as rightfully his property because of his obsession. Catherine gets no say in this, of course, but in Heathcliff's mind, he is obsessed with her, and therefore she is rightly his. Incels do be like that. He decides, therefore, that he must be cruel to Isabella because of how her brother Edgar has, in his mind, wronged him. He states this very matter-of-factly, as though it is simply the natural order. He's a computer running a program, and as we say in programming, garbage in, garbage out. It's in this way, and in his obsession with Catherine, that he sees himself really as entirely lacking in free will. He accepts, without question, the presupposition that without Catherine, he cannot be complete, declaring, "I cannot live without my life, I cannot live without my soul," at the midpoint of the book where Catherine dies. In his grief, and really also throughout the book, he remains completely incapable of looking inwards and considering the notion that he might be in control of his own actions. Instead, he tries to control and to constrict those around him. He's very good at scheming, as we see when he manipulates Hindley Earnshaw through his gambling habits to gain possession of Wuthering Heights. We don't know how Heathcliff earned enough money to lend it to Hindley to cover his gambling debts before taking repayment in the form of Wuthering Heights plus servitude, but it really doesn't matter. People with no scruples can get money. So Heathcliff projects an image of wealth and power. He tightly controls the people in his life, particularly the women, using very brutal methods. He's not introspective and doesn't take responsibility for his actions. and he's not happy. The only emotion he really allows himself is anger, born of entitlement, a massive victim complex, and a burning need for vengeance. He's basically Andrew Tate, which leads to the question, did Emily Brontë invent toxic masculinity? And have all toxic men simply been following her example? No, that's stupid. So what does it say about us humans that all the behaviours that we understand as toxic masculinity existed fully formed in a book published in 1847? Sobering thought, isn't it? My point is that this is not a love story, not even a little bit. It remains incredibly romantic, but not in the flowers and chocolates way. More in the forcing my son to marry into a particular family and letting him die young so I can take control of the property where the woman with whom I've been obsessed since childhood, despite never actually being romantically involved, is buried so that I might be buried next to her. This is a book about ghosts, but it's not a book that believes in ghosts in a physical sense. The spirit of Catherine that haunts Heathcliff and gives him the twisted sort of company that he needs from her is entirely an invention of his own desperate, obsessed mind. He sees everything in his life through the lens of this obsession. And as his obsession grows, without Catherine being physically in his life, his stupid, lonely, angry brain fills in the gaps. You see, men, this is what happens. You use people only as instruments to achieve your own ends, and it follows then quite naturally that your entire life must be given over to your obsession. Heathcliff never sees another person in this book as someone who could be loved and appreciated separate from Catherine, but only as someone he can use to get closer to Catherine in one way or another. This book is often credited as introducing many a teenage girl in her English literature class to the concept of the bad boy, and almost guaranteeing a tumultuous first few years on the dating scene, because of how thoroughly this work is misunderstood. You only need to take a brief look at the 1939 film adaptation to see how this book was and is interpreted as nothing more than a great and tragic love story where the central characters Catherine and Heathcliff have done nothing wrong, but are simply held apart by circumstance with all the toxicity stripped away. Which includes, of course, the entire second half of the book after Catherine dies and Heathcliff descends even deeper into his dark, twisted obsession. The term often used to describe Heathcliff is as a Byronic hero, an anti-hero archetype named for Lord Byron, described by historian Lord Macaulay as a man proud, moody, cynical, with defiance on his brow and misery in his heart, a scorner of his kind, implacable in revenge, yet capable of deep and strong affection. And yeah, sounds about right. But I'm not fully comfortable with that description from Lord Macaulay in its entirety as a description of Heathcliff. It's letting him off the hook too much, especially that last part about him being capable of a strong and deep affection. I don't think Heathcliff is. I think he's capable of obsession. I don't think he has love in his heart really for anyone, himself included, and that's clearest in how he treats Isabella. He threatens very clearly to beat her black and blue even before he marries her. He starts his courtship of her by hanging her dog by its neck. Once married, he imprisons her at Wuthering Heights, and we are to assume, from the way that he speaks about her, that his abuse of her continues apace, and when Isabella escapes, she's pregnant. I don't think Lord Macaulay's description of a Byronic hero is one I'm comfortable applying to a rapist.
In their house, sitting there, bored, completely in love with me. And of course, they don't go out. They're not allowed out. Like, oh, Tate's away, so they go out with their friends. No. You don't go to the club with your friends. I don't know what kind of bitch-ass dude is letting his chicks go to the club with her friends without him. No, you stay in the house. You don't go nowhere. You're not, no restaurants, no clubs, nothing. You don't go nowhere, nothing.
Emily Brontë wrote this man to have all the worst possible attributes of a man, with no redeeming qualities whatsoever, and put him into a story where he doesn't get what he wants, and he certainly doesn't get redemption. Although he succeeds in forcing his son Linton and Cathy, his Catherine's daughter of course, to marry, there's no joy in it for him, or for them.
Being married will not be such a bad thing, will it, Catherine?
I'm going to see my father.
It's not because your mother's. I hope you'll be a dutiful daughter.
I defy you to frighten me.
He's not thinking something like, at least my children could have what I could not have. And that would have made sense, by the way. I think Emily Brontë is playing with her audience's expectations. And even though in the background you have Linton's illness giving us a sense of foreboding, the reader should know at this point that Heathcliff is up to something. And it's not going to go well for anyone else. And yet, by Linton's own insistence that his health is improving, there is just enough hope dangled before us for it to eventually be dashed. The dashing comes when Heathcliff imprisons Cathy and forces her to marry Linton. And there's no surprise in any of this in how this plays out. Of course, Heathcliff hates Linton. The only character he possibly hates more than Linton is his mother, Isabella. And right when Heathcliff and Linton meet, he says he can't find anything of himself in Linton, that he only sees Isabella. And that should be more than enough foreshadowing for us to know that there shall never be any kindness or well wishes from Heathcliff to his son. He doesn't want his child to have anything nice, let alone anything that he can't have. He wants what he can't have. He forces the marriage because he knows his son is ill, and when he dies, he'll inherit Thrushcross Grange, where Catherine's buried, and he can have himself buried next to her, and that's always what it's been about. And it's because Heathcliff, like all toxic men, can't allow himself a plan B. He must succeed with his plan A to be with Catherine, even long after she's died. The obsession consumes him and ultimately ruins him. Not financially, obviously, because capitalism doesn't have morality, and usually stands entirely contrary to it. But personally and emotionally, he is ruined. And throughout the novel, he gets to meet and spend time with some genuinely kind, beautiful, innocent people. He could have let go of Catherine at any time and simply enjoyed the people around him as people instead of as pawns. But of course he couldn't. He instead ruins his own life, never knowing a moment of happiness aside from cruelty over his obsession with Catherine and having her for himself. See, even this obsession is not with Catherine as a person, but with Catherine as a possession to be attained. The only time in the book that he's really happy is when he knows he's dying, because he thinks in death that he'll finally be with Catherine. It would only take a soupçon of introspection to learn at any point that he could actually be very happy while still alive, if only he'd take a step back and consider that maybe there could be a plan B. Someone else whose company he could enjoy and with whom he could be genuinely happy. This lesson is made explicit in the end by Cathy's second marriage to Hareton. They're in love and their union in the end is by all accounts a happy one. With Heathcliff gone and Hareton inheriting his estate, there's a happy ending for Wuthering Heights. And I think it's very poignant that this happy ending is a second marriage rather than a first. So the message of Wuthering Heights, if indeed there is one, is that single-minded obsessiveness leads only to misery, and happiness is achieved by actively loving, apologising to, and forgiving those around us who make themselves, by their character, worthy of our time and of our affections. It's an important message for young men today. As Andrew Tate maintains his popularity with our young men and boys, despite credible accusations of rape, kidnapping and human trafficking, like what Heathcliff did, Wuthering Heights may be more important than ever. It's a shame then that this new adaptation won't appeal to them in any way whatsoever then, isn't it? If only a director would lean into the darkness, the toxicity, the hate and the obsession that drives Heathcliff and many of our young men and boys today. That's how you could make a modern adaptation of Wuthering Heights. Thank you for watching. Bye.